as we're waiting for spring to get here. I do have an announcement to make. The Genealogical Society of Southern Illinois will be having our quarterly meeting up at the Centralia Library, and that's going to be March 12th. It's since 1783, when Revolutionary War officers founded the Society of Cincinnati, heritage societies have been an intriguing facet of American cultural history. So that's where we have all these different kinds of organizations. A panel discussion on heritage societies will be presented by the Genealogical Society of Southern Illinois at 1 o'clock on March 12th in the newly renovated Centralia Public Library on East Broadway. Linda Clark, member of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution and the National Society Daughters of the Union from Mount Vernon. James Segoff, member of Sons of the American Revolution and the 1812 Society from Troy. And Lynn Moore McCreary, member of the Jamestown Society and Colonial Dames of the 17th century from Ozark, will discuss heritage societies and the research needed to meet membership requirements. So if any of you have ever wondered, could you fit or get into some of those, that would be the program to go to find out. The program is free, open to the public, and we'll help people with the genealogical research if that's needed. Along with that, I would like to bring up our PR chairman, Cheryl Rankino-Trench, and she will inform you on the rest of the next part of the program.
Well, we're very pleased that
We'll let somebody in.
Lisa just told us the door was locked, so they have to beat the door in. We're very pleased that all of you could come. We're happy to have Dr. Sam Coleman and Carl Maple, some of our illustrious public officials and people who care a great deal about Southern Illinois. I think many of you who are here today share that feeling. And I want to compliment Mr. Buzbee, one of our visitors here today, looked at the picture, and guess who they thought he looked like? He's going to like this. John F. Kennedy. So, I think the picture that we have of Ken dates back to the 70s or the 80s. So, you can still see the man that he was. So, we're very pleased that he could be here today. For those of you who are into quilting, and perhaps many of you are, this will be our third annual quilt exhibition, and it's a huge affair for the Historical Society. It's going to be May the 7th at the Heron Civic Center. If you have a quilt at home that you would like to display, if you're in a group that makes quilts, you simply contact Phil Stucker or Doris Grant Fry, who is the chairman of our quilt exhibit, and it's truly a beautiful event. So May the 7th, remember that. Next month, Lisa Carnegie has contacted a very interesting author about the 1925 tornado, and she will be here to speak to us on the very date of that tornado, which was March the 18th. So we hope we have a full house that day. We also hope the weather is fine and there are no tornadoes that day. So we thank you for coming. We hope you'll join us again. And I'll turn it over to Gordon Pruitt. He's our program chair for today, and he brings us very many interesting programs. He's going to introduce our guest today. So, welcome.
And as Cheryl did, she mentioned Dr. Goldman being with us today, and I'd also like to mention Carl Maple and Dennis Johnson that made the trek from Carbondale. We appreciate you.
Conrad too. We got WP. We got all kinds of PhDs wandering around there.
We could all stand up and introduce ourselves.
Need to get out of here today. Today's speaker is Kenneth Buzbee, who was born in Anna the same year, to put this in historical perspective, since we are a historical society, same year that the Hindenburg exploded and Amelia Earhart vanished. And he also shares the birthday, he told me, with Winston Churchill, but he also shares the exact same birthday as a current film director whose work I like, Ridley Scott, who directed Alien, Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise, Gladiator, and most recently The Martian. So he's still very accomplished and going strong at his age. But while Ken was attending Southern, he worked as a broadcaster at WRAJ in Anna, WGGH in Marion, and WJPF in Heron, where he worked with Bob Walker and Irv Copey and people are still talking about some of his on-air and off-air antics. He earned 2 degrees at SIU and was part of the creation of Southern's first public radio station, WSRV-FM, which is now WSIU-FM. He served 3 years in the Marine Corps and retired from the Corps Reserve in 1988 at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He was elected to the Illinois Senate in '72 and served until 1985. In 1984, he sought the seat being vacated by Paul Simon in the U.S. House, but he lost to Ken Gray in the Democratic primary that year. From '85 to '96, he worked as a consultant, lobbyist, and businessman, and in 1999, he was named director of the Business Services Department of the Illinois Secretary of State's office, and he retired in 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Buzbee.
Thank you, Gordon. I want to correct something for the record. I don't know if anybody bothered to read that news story or not that was in the Southern Illinoisan, but I am not 79 years old. I'm only 78. I want everybody to understand that. At this age, that 1 year makes a big, big difference. I want to thank Gordon and Cheryl. Gordon and I have had an ongoing discussion for years that we have shared the same dream. We both dream we're back in college. It's time for final exams. We haven't been to class all semester. We don't have the textbook. We don't know where the class meets, and we don't know what time the exam is. But other than that, we are solid college students. My good friends, by the way, Dr. Sam Goldman, Dr. David Conrad, who was a retired history professor at SIU, Dr. Carl Maple, retired political science professor at Logan, and Dennis Johnson, retired math teacher. There is going to be an exam at the end of this, by the way. And they're going to pass out the papers to do that. I want to thank Gordon and Cheryl. I would like to introduce my wife, Betty, who is a retired public school teacher, taught for, I think it was about 135 years. From her explanations every night when she came home, it seemed like it was 135 years. My ties with Heron go back a long, long way. When I was a senior in high school, junior and senior in high school at Anna Jonesboro, our speech teacher there at that time was Lucille Vick Howell. And I had Lucille as a senior. Plus, she directed me in 2 different plays that we were in. I remember that, Cry of the Banshee and Mother Was a Freshman. I remember those 2 plays. Lucille was one of those people, when she walked into a room, she filled up the room. She was a huge personality. And one of the most interesting people I ever knew. At that time, I thought she was ancient. She probably was in her early 60s. She used to tell us stories constantly. She told us lots of Heron stories, by the way. And as those you Heronites know, Lucille's home was next door to Hal Trevillion's home. And Paul Angle stayed with Hal Trevilion while he was researching and writing Bloody Williamson. Right. Lucille used to always say that she was going to write the sequel to Bloody Williamson when she got ready to die, but not before then, because she knew good and well she would die very quickly after she published her sequel. Now, to the best of my knowledge, Lucille died of natural causes, and to the best of my knowledge, she never wrote her sequel. She also, of course, she was Lucille Vick of Klein Vick drugstores. But I remember all of this, by the way, from 1953, when I mean, 54. And something you may not have known about the Vick family, she said her family were the folks who started Vicksburg, Mississippi. And she used to tell the story. Lucille was a great storyteller. We, the students, as we figured out one time that we were going to see how long we could keep her off topic, because she loved to talk and she loved to tell stories. So we made it up in the class beforehand We went 3 solid weeks that we kept her off topic, as Lucille was telling one story after the other, after the other, after the other. And then after I got into public office, even though Heron was not in my district, I did run in Heron a time or two before reapportionment and when I ran for Congress. And Lucille would always come to events where I was going to be and come up and talk to me. I think she was still trying to decide about what kind of a grade to give me on my speech that day. And then I went to visit her one time in her home, and she showed me, I remember, this beautiful wooden music stand, which her story, I am not going to vouch for this, but her story was, it had been given to her by Lionel Barrymore, and he had used it while rehearsing on stage on Broadway before he had his script memorized, and that's what he had his script propped up on. That was when I was in high school. And then when I was in college, as Gordon said, I worked in radio. I worked my way through college as a newscaster, and sometimes really didn't want to be disc jockey, but sometimes I had to do that. The news is what I really wanted to do. And I ended up getting a job at WJPF. This was in 1959. Now, in my mind, WJPF was one of the giants of the broadcasting industry. WJPF was one of the first radio stations in Illinois. I don't know exactly where they came in the sequence, but it was either WGN or WBBM in Chicago were first, and Heron was real close in there. WJPF at that time was owned by the Larla family of Decatur. And I don't know, did they ever live in Heron?
Yes.
They did, okay. And of course, the manager of WJPF was Charlie Cook. Nobody called him Charlie Cook. We all called him Mr. Cook. And years later, I went to a roast of Mr. Cook. I think he was dying at that point, and they brought back a whole lot of people that had worked at WJPF for this roast. And we revealed that night that we all called him Mr. Cook. And there was a guy that had worked at WJPF years before any of us did. He said, I worked there when Charlie Cook was 27 or 28 years old. He was Mr. Cook then. Don't think you had anything new. And then the talent that was there at that radio station was just incredible. Bob Walker, Bob was probably in his late 20s, I was 21 at that time. Bob Walker was one of the incredible talents. He had this deep, docile voice, and whenever he talked, you just couldn't help but listen. And he was also one of the most talented writers I have ever seen. He had a 5-minute local newscast, sportscast, pardon me. I think it was at 5 minutes till 4 every day. And Bob would come in at about 4:45, and he would sit down at the typewriter, and he'd type out his 5-minute sportscast. Boom, 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 like that. Now again, this was 1959, recall. 2 years after the Heron statewide championship in basketball. And I remember one day, Heron had lost the basketball game the day before. And Bob came in and he sat down and he started writing. And he got on the air and he said, all right, Heron, take down the black bunting. So a bunch of 16-year-old kids lost a ball game last night. It's not the end of the world. What about the kid that is working their tail off in chemistry or in mathematics? And they went, I said, oh, you can't do that. This is Heron, Illinois. You can't tell them things like this. No. Bob was also one of the best play-by-play sports guys I ever heard in my life. I've got a quick anecdote that I've got to tell about Bob. Bob was in college a long time, a long time. He was a voice major, and he studied under Marjorie Lawrence at SIU, the great Australian opera star. And voice majors were required to have German, a year of German. Bob couldn't pass German. And so, you know, he was in college a long time. In fact, that's where he met his wife. She was also a Marjorie Lawrence a student. And her daddy had some money, and they were from Dallas. And when they got married and they went back to Dallas, Daddy-in-law said, there's only going to be one opera singer in this family, and it's not going to be you, Bob. And so he got him a job at WFAA TV in Dallas. And those of you who witnessed the events around the John Kennedy assassination know that Bob Walker was the anchorman for ABC television nationwide. I was in the Marine Corps. Betty and I were both absolutely brokenhearted, and we were watching television one afternoon, and Bob Walker's on the air live. Things are a lot different then than they are now. There was a telephone setting on his desk, and in fact, I've seen reruns of this just within this past year. There's been a whole rerun about what the media did with the Kennedy assassination. Bob is live on the air, the telephone's on his desk, people are off camera, handing him copy, giving him verbal instructions, and Bob is like this, and the phone rings, and he picks up the phone, and he's still on the air. He's nationwide. And he's yes, okay, all right, something has happened at City Hall, he said. We don't know what it is, but we'll have it for you shortly. Well, what had happened, of course, was the Jack Ruby shooting of Oswald. From that, Bob was taken to New York and was on ABC television in New York. Because of his appearance, Bob was a big man. I mean, he was just a big man, period. He was fat on top of it. And he didn't look good on television. And so they didn't keep him on television long. But I heard him for years. I heard him on ABC radio. But the incident I was going to tell was when he was in a summer musical at SIU. He was in Most Happy Fella. Now, those of you that know the story of Most Happy Fella, Tony, the proprietor, the Italian proprietor of a small California winery. And at one scene in the show, Tony is involved in a truck accident. He's driving his pickup truck and he's involved in a truck accident. Well, another friend of mine had the other lead. The other lead is the romantic lead. That was Bob Green. Bob Green was, he's, I think, the foreman in the show. Tony is Bob Walker. And so the accident obviously happens off stage. It's pretty hard to stage a accident scene on live stage. And so they carry Tony on stage, and Bob Green's line is, Jesus, it's Joe. And because Walker was so big, the only thing they could get to carry him on was a door. They actually had a door, so four guys have got the corners of this door. And as they get onto the stage, Bob Green says, Joe, it's Jesus. Walker got so tickled, he rolled off the door and fell on the concrete stage in the auditorium. Irv Copey worked at WJPF, major talent. Irv Copey had been on a series, on a radio series in Chicago. That's how he got, I guess that's where he first started in radio, I don't know. When I worked with Irv, how old is Irv now, in his late 80s?
I think he's going to be 91.
91, okay, well, I'm 70 years old, okay. When I was 21, he was 34, somewhere around there. And he had spent years at WGGH in Marion, if you remember, and he used to do that show on the radio that called the Revolving Bandstand. And the Revolving Bandstand, he would have an artist. Today it's Tommy Dorsey. Tommy Dorsey's orchestra. Well, and then he would talk to Tommy. Well, Tommy, how's everything going for you? Everything going all right? So blah, 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 blah. Nobody, I could never figure out why Tommy never talked back to him, but anyhow. And this is when I was in high school. I used to listen to Copey do this. And one of the favorite jokes around high school was, listen, Egyptian Bandstand, that was the name of it. listen, I know somebody can get you tickets to Egyptian Bandstand. Would you like to have tickets to Egyptian? Yeah, okay, fine, yeah. Where is it, by the way? Nobody had ever seen it. Nobody knew where it was. Anyhow, Kopi had this great thing that he did with that. And then he came to WJPF after that. Again, a major talent. Hank Wright. Hank Wright was the morning man. I think he got on the air like at 4 o'clock in the morning, did all the country and western music, and he also had that Johnny Cash type voice down like this, and Hank Wright knew his country music. People loved Hank Wright, absolutely loved him. He decided at one point to run for county commissioner of Williamson County. I don't know if anybody ran against him or not, but if they did, poor soul, because everybody loved Hank Wright, and I think he spent a number of years as a county commissioner after that. And then there was Frank Samuels, who was the traffic man. Frank was later mayor of Carterville. His wife worked with him at WJPF. And Freddie Simmons, that was the salesperson. So boy, and I was 21 years old. And man, oh man, what a group of talent. I was the fill-in guy. I was the, one weekend, it was I don't remember now, it was homecoming or what it was at SIU. Bob Walker's the guy that did all the scheduling of the announcers. I was the fill-in guy. They put me wherever somebody else had to be off or whatever. So I had this date coming from Chicago. She was going to school in Chicago, and she was coming down on the train for the weekend. And so I asked Walker, I said, Bob, let me have off this whole weekend, please. I'll make up, I'll work any other times you will, blah, blah, blah. Well, sure enough, he assigned me to the Sunday morning sign-on shift. So anyhow, I'm with the date. I take her to her hotel, and I start heading for WJPF. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning. When I get there, the engineer he got me started. He got the transmitter on and so forth. And we had some preachers coming in fairly early, like at 8 or 9 o'clock. But before that, we just played long LP, album music until then on Sunday morning. So anyhow, I had this LP going, and I look over at the record, and I've got about 8 or 9 minutes left on the cut. I look up at the clock, and it's 5 minutes before I'm supposed to hit the network for the news or whatever it was. So I thought, well, this won't be any problem. I laid my head down, and at about 10 minutes till 8, I heard somebody say, "Ken!" And I looked up, and it was the engineer. He'd come back. He said, I was pulling in my driveway, and I heard the thump. He said, I knew exactly what had happened. So he came out. He called Walker. Walker came out. I said, Bob, I'm fine now. The adrenaline's pumping. I can stay awake for the next 48 hours. I'm fine. Let me go ahead and finish my shift. No, you go get some sleep. I'll finish your shift. Oh, okay. So I thought, well, that's going to be that. Well, turns out nothing else was said about it. And so several months later, I was resigning to go over to WGGH. I had a job over there offered that was newsman, and I had a good buddy that worked there, a very, very dear friend who kept pushing me, you gotta come here, and on and on and on. So I finally agreed. So I went in to tell Mr. Cook that I was resigning. And Mr. Cook, in his inimitable way, said, oh, well, Ken, we've enjoyed having you here. You've done a good job for us, and things went very well. There was that one incident where you fell asleep on the air. Now, I didn't know that Mr. Cook even knew about that because he was out of town that weekend. But whenever he did know about it, he never said anything about it to me until I left. A couple of other people errand people I want to mention. When I first ran for office in 1970, I ran for state representative. And you'll remember back in those days, before they changed it, we used to elect 3 representatives from every district. You had 3 votes. You could cast all 3 of them for 1, 1.5 apiece for 2, or 1 apiece for 3. And so anyhow, Clyde Choate was the leading Democrat. Everybody knew Clyde was going to be reelected. The two Republican members of the House at that time from this district were C.L. McCormick from Vienna and Gail Williams from Murfreesboro. And then there were 5 of us in the Democratic primary, 2 to be nominated. Everybody knows Clyde's going to be nominated. And so the other 4 of us are trying to get that second spot. So somebody told me, if you want to do any good in Heron, you better go talk to Frances Jeter. So I don't know if any of you remember Frances Jeter or not. I went and knocked on her door. She and her husband were very, very hospitable and very nice. I'm 32 years old at that point. And she kind of gives me the evil eye, and we talked a while, and she said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be for you. Now, and any of you who have ever been involved in politics know that there are people who say, I'm going to be for you, and it doesn't mean diddly. Then there are people who say, I'm going to be for you, and it means a whole lot. Frances was in that latter category. Everybody in her precinct, she knew, and most of them, she brought coal to in the wintertime. She brought their groceries to them. She took them to the doctor. And when Frances went around and knocked on the door and said, I'd like for you to vote for Buzbee, they voted for Buzbee. And that's what happened with Frances and me. And then the other person that I cannot remember his first name. His brother is Ray Cerati, who was a reporter in Springfield for years and years and years. Ray and I have had lots of interactions over the years in Springfield, but his brother's name was obviously Cerati, but I don't remember. Frank, thank you. A tradition back then was that the Sunday before elections in Heron, Illinois, the Democratic, Frank Cerati would take all the Democratic candidates and take them to the Rome Club, what was the other?
CC Club?
CC Club, and he would give them a speech in Italian. I didn't know one word of Italian. I did know, I take that back, I did know one word, Buzbee. Because whenever he got around Buzbee, then I go like this. I have no idea what he said. He may have said, no, vote for this, I don't know. But anyhow, that was a fun time. I did that a couple of times. It was a great, great time, and I loved the heritage of Heron. I loved the interaction of the people and so forth. Well, now I'm getting to the beginning of my speech. First of all, I got to let you know that I'm somebody that thinks that government is supposed to work. And that means unless everybody can agree and be of one mind, that there has to be compromise. There's not going to be a utopia where we can agree on everything. Therefore, if we're going to self-govern, as democracies are supposed to do, we have to give a little in order to get a little. In other words, compromise. Now, I'm aware of the dangers, rather, of handing out unsolicited advice. I'm reminded of the small schoolgirl's profound summation. Socrates, she wrote, was a Greek philosopher who went about giving people good advice. They poisoned him. It reminds me of Winston Churchill. He and Lady Astor had an ongoing conflict, and they didn't like each other. Lady Astor said to Sir Winston one time, Sir Winston, if I were your wife, I would poison your soup. And he said, Lady Astor, if I were your husband, I would drink it. I got another Winston story, and I can't think of it right now. I didn't write that down. I should have written it down. Oh, yeah, I remember. Sir Winston, as you know, was well known for his copious consumption of alcoholic beverages. I mean, this man started at breakfast and literally drank all day long. Now, breakfast usually wasn't until 11 or 12 o'clock because he didn't ever get up till then. because he stayed in bed writing until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, did this every day, and he continued to consume alcohol all day long. Lady asked her in the Parliament meeting late one night, she came up to him and she said, "Sir Winston, you were drunk." And he said, "Yes, Lady Astor, and you are ugly. But tomorrow morning I will be sober." So Winston wasn't one to be put down easily. You know, and he loved Franklin Roosevelt. And he did everything in the world to court Franklin Roosevelt to get the U.S. into World War II. And then it took the Japanese to finally accomplish that because of the politics of the U.S. at that time. When they bombed Pearl Harbor, then that finally brought us into World War II. Then Hitler, 2 or 3 days later, declared a war on the U.S. I still don't understand that. Nor do I understand why Hitler decided to declare a war on the Soviet Union, but that's, anyhow. I lost my thought. Maybe I am 79. I don't know if that's ever happened to you or not, but anyhow, I want to try to give you a little bit of a feel for my experience in the legislature and try to somehow really relate that to what's going on today. Back then, being a political partisan and generally supporting your party's position did not mean that you had to intensely dislike the members of the other side of the aisle. And you didn't have to refuse to negotiate with them. Refusal to compromise was never an option, nor was it a sign of weakness. After all, compromise is the art of and definition of politics. I remember the story, I forgot. The story was that when Churchill came as a guest of FDR in the White House, and he came and he stayed, and he stayed, and he stayed, and he stayed. Eleanor was getting a little irate because he was there for so long. But Sir Winston had absolutely no, he was not embarrassed about anything. And he continued to do his same lifestyle. He would keep Roosevelt up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning talking while Winston's drinking all this time. And Roosevelt wasn't used to that. And then the next morning, he'd stay in bed till 11 or 12 o'clock, whereas Roosevelt was used to getting up at 6:37, whatever it was. Anyhow, Roosevelt one day wheeled himself in, because he was in his wheelchair all the time. He wheeled himself into Churchill's bedroom, and Churchill had just gotten out of his bath, buck naked. Of course, there's an embarrassed silence, and Sir Winston looked up and he said, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has absolutely nothing to hide from the President of the United States." You got to love a man that's that quick on his feet. Again, when I was in the legislature, committee chairs had a huge amount of power, especially in the Senate. Compared to today, when respective leaders of both parties in both chambers make most of the decisions on policy and on individual bills. I was chairman of one of the 2 Senate Appropriation Committees, and I served on the other one. Between the other chairman and myself, we made 90 to 95% of the decisions on these 2 most powerful committees in the Senate. In our Democratic caucus one day, Holly Carroll, by the way, was the chairman of the other Appropriations Committee from Chicago. The 2 most powerful committees in the Senate, by the way, one chaired by a guy from Chicago, one chaired by a guy from Carbondale. Not too bad for a little snotty-nosed country kid. Somebody asked in our Democratic caucus, how come Buzbee and Carroll get to make all the money decisions? And Phil Ropp, my good friend Phil Ropp, right here, he was the president of the Senate. He just died. I went to his funeral last week in Chicago. Ropp looked up. Ropp was a man of few words, and he said, "Because somebody has to. Next question." And that was it. By the way, Phil, well, his son gave the eulogy at the funeral, and one of the things he said, my dad being a man of few words, he said he reminded me that It's like an old-fashioned Irish wake. He said, the corpse is the reason the party is going on. But secondly, we don't expect him to say a whole lot. So he wanted to remind his son, you remember that also. Phil always used to say that he was born a Catholic, a Democrat, and a Chicago Cubs fan, and not necessarily in that order. My areas of legislative emphasis and expertise were, number one, money. Who controls the money controls. It was amazing how many very close personal friends I accumulated during that period when I controlled the money. Just absolutely amazing. I had department directors that, can I take you to dinner? Does your suit need pressing? Whatever. And then after I left, almost all those friends disappeared. It was kind of a strange thing. I didn't quite understand it all. But anyhow, the money, education, elementary and secondary, and in particular, higher education. 3, energy, both coal and alternative energy. That was an area where, in fact, I was one of 2 politicians appointed by President Carter to the White House Advisory Council on coal. The other politician was then Governor J. Rockefeller of West Virginia. Everybody else on that commission was either from labor or from management or from the federal bureaucracy. I got to be close friends with J. Rockefeller during that time. I never called him Jay, even though we were the same age. I always called him Governor. And it was fun because whenever I would call him, I would call the governor's office in West Virginia. And the number that he gave me, there was a secretary that answered the phone, and I would tell her who I was and that I wanted to speak to the governor. And just like that, he'd say, "Hi, Ken, how you doing?" I've never had that relationship with too many governors, I got to tell you. Anyhow, he was fun to work with, and we did a lot of great things in the coal area. Number 4 area that I worked in was children's policy, such as child abuse and neglect and adoption. Through the Appropriations Committee chairmanship, I handle the budgets of the Departments of Public Health, Mental Health, Corrections, Public Aid, Agriculture, Children and Family Services, and of course elementary and secondary education, and each of the higher education systems. Back then there were 5 education systems: the University of Illinois, Southern Illinois University, the Board of Regents, the Board of Governors, and the Community Colleges Board. Now they've all got their own boards, and I'm not sure how they report up. By the way, and again, to show you how things worked back then, whenever I was getting ready for an committee meeting, I would go over all the bills, look at everything, and then I would make my decisions. Here's how I want this to go, here's how I want that to go, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would get with David Regner, who was the Republican spokesman on my committee. And David was a guy that knew the appropriations process up one side and down the other. He'd been in the House for a number of years before he came to the Senate, and he'd been the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee for quite some time. So I would go to David and I'd say, here's what I'm going to do on this bill. He'd go down the list with me and say, okay, I'll support you on that, I'll support you on that, I'll support you. I'm going to fight you on this one. Okay, fine, you fight me, we have the fight, we take the vote. I win, you lose, because I got the votes and you don't. Yes, that's right, that's the way it is. David and I got along great. And he, by the way, was an old-fashioned conservative. He was very conservative. He didn't like Jim Thompson, the Republican governor, because he thought Thompson was way too liberal. Fought Thompson all over the place, all the time. But David and I got along just fine, even though our political philosophies were like this, because we respected each other and we just made it a point to get along. And when we have our fights, we have our little short fight, we get it settled, get it over with, we go on. Thompson used to always get very much involved. And by the way, in my opinion, through the years, I have known personally or worked with Dan Walker, Jim Thompson, Jim Edgar, George Ryan. I did not know Blagojevich, I'm proud to say, until that campaign. And I don't know the current governor. I knew, well, what's his name?
Pat Quinn.
Pat Quinn, thank you. Name that's also easy to forget. But anyhow, I knew Pat Quinn when he was 25 years old. I just didn't think he was a very good governor. And whose fault that was, I don't know, but I didn't think he was a very good governor. And by the way, of all of those that I just named, the ones that I knew and didn't know, Jim Thompson was the best governor, in my opinion, that I ever worked with. Jim Edgar was the second best. Dan Walker could have been a fantastic governor, but Dan Walker, all he wanted to do was fight with Mayor Daley all the time. And, you know, there were times when you're supposed to fight with Mayor Daley, you needed to fight with Mayor Daley, but not every day, 24 hours a day, and that's what he did, which I think spoiled, if not ruined, his 4 years of being governor. And then I belonged to a group that was called the Crazy Eight. Actually, we called ourselves the Democratic Study Group. It was seven downstate Democratic senators and one Chicago senator. The downstaters were, besides myself, Terry Bruce, who served a number of years in Congress. After that, Terry is the the CEO of Illinois Eastern Community Colleges in Albany. He has 4 colleges that he's been administering for years. Billy Morris from Waukegan, we always call Billy the Wild Man. He never wore shoes on the floor of the Senate. He always walked around in his stocking feet. And if he happened to run into a statue, he wanted to get in a fight with it. Billy wanted to fight with everything and everybody. Later, he became mayor of Waukegan. And he said, you know, I took that same attitude to become mayor of Waukegan when I became mayor of Waukegan. And he said, then I started noticing that I was losing every issue 5-1. All the councilmen voted against him, and he was the only aye vote. So he said, I decided maybe I better change my approach. Don Wooten, who was from the Quad Cities, Don was a legitimate Shakespearean and Latin scholar. And we had a Republican colleague who used to keep a little black book that he would have Shakespearean quotes written in, and he would read those from time to time, or he'd read a Latin quote. Don would come over to me and he'd say, you know, you got that wrong. I said, well, Don, why don't you stand up and correct him? Because he's so pompous, you know, and he's, oh, no, I'm not going to do that. But he said it wrong, all right, or whatever. And then Jerry Joyce, the farmer from Kankakee area, we always called him outstanding in his field. And Vince DiMuzio from Carlinville, who later became the chairman of the state Democratic Party for a few years. Vivian Hickey. Vivian is 98 years old, still living in California. She's got a son that's a doctor out there. And she is in an assisted living home. And every 6 months, he sends us an email about Vivian. Vivian and Dawn Netsch, the Democrat from Chicago, the two of them were the epitome of the definition of a lady. And, but the toughest ladies you have ever seen. I mean, these gals were tough. One day in a Democratic caucus, one of our senators from Chicago went off on a temper tantrum. I've never seen anything like it. He did it for 20 straight minutes. The veins on his neck were standing out. And he was using one expletive after another, after another, after another. I was seated along the wall between Jerry Joyce and Dawn Netsch. Dawn Netsch was a law professor at Northwestern University, an incredible scholar, and Jerry Joyce kept saying to me, ain't this something? Ain't this something? He did me like that. Shut up, Jerry, I'll come after you and me next. And anyhow, with all of these expletives deleted, Dawn would say, oh my, oh my, oh my, every time he came out with one of these. And she was the independent Democrat from Chicago. Remember back then, they were pretty well divided in the city. I mean, there were quote, the regular Democrats, and that was the people that were part of the Daily organization. And then the ones that are along, for the most part, they were the wealthy liberals that lived along the lake shore that fought the Daily organization. Dawn was one of those. And we had a meeting one time with the Crazy Eight, and my buddy Billy Morris, he went off on a big long one expletive after the other, after the other, after the other. There was a stunned silence for 30 seconds, and to try to break the tension, I looked at Dawn and I said, "Say, Netch, if you're going to run with the boys, you're going to have to learn to talk like one of the boys." She looked at me and she gave me an elbow back and she said, "Say, Buzbee, I was one of the boys before you were one of the boys." Getting to the current impasse, this is absolutely unique in Illinois history, I believe. By the way, Pennsylvania is, I don't know if they still are or not, but a couple of weeks ago, they were in exactly the same impasse. Except there, they've got a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature, and they had not passed the current budget as of 2 or 3 weeks ago. I don't know if they have since then or not. The history of how we got where we are, 4 years, for 4 years, the temporary income tax increase was in effect from 2011 to January 1 of 2015. Illinois paid down its accumulated debt of $11 billion, paid it down to $4 billion. It is now back up to $6 billion plus. I don't know where north of $6 billion, but it's still going up. Also, during those 4 years, the state paid $7 billion per year into the state's pension systems. The only time period that much has been paid in. Here's an interesting little fact. Of all of the states who have a state income tax, and not all of them do, not all states have a state, but of the ones that do, there are only 2 states that do not tax retirement income. And guess who the other one is, besides Illinois? It's that great state of Mississippi. Now, if Illinois did tax the retirement income, it would bring in an additional approximately $1 billion a year. Not enough to close the deficit, but certainly a lot better than not having the $1 billion. If you gave an exemption of, say, the first 35,000 or 50,000 or 60,000 of income, if you gave that exemption to retirees, that obviously would reduce that $1 billion down some. I don't know how much. However, this is all, pardon my pun, this is all academic, because it ain't going to happen. You know, we old people, we vote, and the politicians all know about that, and they are scared to death of us. And so they're not about to impose a tax on we old people that are in retirement. Do I think that it should be done? Yes, I do. I use as many of the state services as my children or grandchildren do, but it's not going to happen, I don't think. The number one issue facing the state right now is the budget deficit, of course. Number 2, cuts alone will not close the deficit. The governor's cuts-only approach is simply not balanced. The legislature has pushed for a balanced approach, cuts and new revenue. The governor could have used his line item veto or his reduction veto on the last budget that the legislature passed, but he did not. He did use the line item veto on the capital appropriation bills. The capital appropriation is, you know, for the most part, is paid for by bonds. It's not paid for out of revenue that comes in today. If we're going to build a new building, we go out and we sell bonds for 20 years and pay for those bonds on a piecemeal basis like you and I do with our home mortgage. But the governor chose to veto everything except elementary and secondary education and the capital bill, again, which is paid for with bonds, leaving universities and community colleges without any funding. By the way, 90% of the budget today is required, is by court order. Different groups have gone to court and have said, they got a court order that's saying, you gotta pay us. I want to tell Randy Dunn, the president of SIU, you guys ought to do the same thing. Go get a court order. Go to court, sue the state, get a court order. That's the only way you're going to get any money right now. I don't know how long community colleges and universities are going to be able to exist. Some of them are going to close this year. There's a couple in the Chicago area that will probably close in March or April of this year. I am told that Eastern Illinois and Western Illinois are both in trouble. I don't know how long they can exist. SIU is making it right now. I don't know how long they're going to be able to make it. I know they are proceeding along as they intend to hold school. And it's a great, great university. And it just irritates the living devil out of me that the state is not interested enough in public higher education, that we can't get that university and Logan College and so forth, and we can't get it funded. The governor argues we should change workers' compensation, restrict collective bargaining and prevailing wage in exchange for finalizing the budget. Democrats are not going to agree to dismantling these three areas. Is there a place for compromise? I think that workers' comp is an area where possible could have some compromise. The legislature passed reform in workers' comp in 2011, but the insurance companies have not lowered their rates, according to a new study by the Workers' Compensation Research Institute of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Even though costs are down, insurance companies are not passing on the savings to the employer. Now, you know, insurance companies are regulated in the state of Illinois by the Department of Insurance. It is not a strong regulator. Directors of departments have, for years, Democrat and Republican, been in a revolving door with the insurance industry. A director leaves as the head of the Department of Insurance that's regulating insurance companies and goes to work for Kemper Insurance in a big job, or some such. By the way, I just read where Tim Geithner is. He found a job, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, and his first year he's going to make millions and millions and millions of dollars out of one of those banks that he was regulating, supposedly. More insurance companies are coming into Illinois to write workers' comp, apparently because it's so lucrative. I've been told that workers' comp insurance rates are higher in Wisconsin and Indiana than they are in Illinois. In closing, I would like to say I love my service in the General Assembly. I believe that I serve the best interests of Southern Illinois and had a disproportionate share of power through my appropriation chairmanship and my coal and energy leadership, which I use to great advantage for this area. I admire legislators who achieve positions of power which they then use to help their districts, and who occasionally cast unpopular votes because it is the right thing to do, and it may hurt them politically, such as Representative John Bradley. Smart, gutsy, honest politicians in the Paul Simon mold should be honored, not censored. You know, years ago, and they still do, if you're a member of the legislature, you get a license plate that says official on there. And back when I was in the legislature, we used to have things called service station attendants. Do you remember them? And I stopped one day to get gasoline, and the service station attendant came out. He looked at my license plate. He said, "You one of them fellers up in Springfield?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Some pretty smart folks up there, aren't there?" And I said, "Well, yes, there are." He said, "Some pretty dumb ones too, aren't there?" I said, "Well, yes, there are." He said, "Sometimes it's pretty hard to tell the difference, isn't it?" So thank you very much. I'll be willing to take questions. Shouldn't ever give an ex-politician an unlimited time. Yes, ma'am.
When you said you would explain how we got to this and began with that temporary income tax.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I wish you would go back before that, because there was a problem or they wouldn't have gone to the so-called temporary increase. What really put us in this
Well,
situation?
I absolutely agree with you. And by the way, I am one of those Democrats who thinks that George Ryan was not the bad guy that everybody played him out to be. I knew George for years. I can't address what he went to prison for because I don't know that much about it. But the profligate spending started under George Ryan and continued and was exacerbated under Rod Blagojevich. I was working for the Secretary of State, Jesse White, in Springfield. I headed the Department of Business Services for Jesse. When Jesse succeeded George Ryan as Secretary of State. And my office was in the building right next door to the Capitol building. And every day I would read about what they're doing in the legislature and what the governor's proposed. And I'm sitting there, this is when George is governor I'm talking about. I'm shaking my head, this is crazy. Why are they opening all these new programs? Why are they spending all this money? Things are good right now, but things always get bad. I used to give that speech on the floor of the Senate. I probably gave it 7 or 8 times in my career. Don't go overboard with your spending now, because the time's going to come when our revenue's going to start doing this. So, let's don't open a whole bunch of new programs now that we're not able to sustain. When Blagojevich came into office, he was even worse. I don't think he had any idea. I don't think he cared. I don't think he intended to ever act as the governor. I looked back to my days when Jim Thompson was the governor, and we got to one of these money problems or some insurmountable problem, and Jim Thompson would get up to here in it himself. He would get involved. I used to say that Thompson would, when they got to some of those major issues, that he'd call the four legislative leaders, come over to the mansion. He'd put a bottle of Jack Daniels and 5 glasses on the table, lock the door, and say, "Okay, boys, we're staying here till we get this solved." Rod Blagojevich never, ever did anything like that. He never tried to work out anything with anybody. George Ryan did try, but George was a sort of guy that he wanted to be everybody's friend. I think that's what got him into the money problems, into the problems that he had that he went to prison for eventually. I remember one time we had a box at the DuQuoin Fair at the World Trotting Derby. And our box was right in front of the governor's box. George was there, and I told him about this project that I was involved in at that time, which was a little long after I left the Senate, obviously, which was a bicycle trail from the headwaters of the Mississippi at Lake Itasca, Minnesota, all the way down to the Gulf. Called the Mississippi River Trail that we were working on. And I was explaining this to him, and he said, "You need any money?" And I said, no, we don't need any money right now. Later we did need some money, as a matter of fact. But that was George's attitude. If you need any money, I'll help you. But let me back up a little bit before George Ryan. The pension systems started getting in trouble long time ago. While I was there, the pension systems were starting to get into trouble. And I was always advocating that we ought to put more money into the pension systems. My very dear friend Phil Rock, who I loved like a brother, he was a mentor for me in the legislature, even though we were the same age, but he got there 2 years before I did. He was a brilliant lawyer. He was one of the few guys I've ever seen who could pick up a bill and go like that and tell you the whole impact of it. I'd spend 2 or 3 hours reading it, and I'd go back and look at it anyhow. Phil Rock said to me, "I don't understand why we ought to be putting more money into pension systems. We're not going to have to pay that out for years and years and years." I said, "Phil, I think that is a very, very dangerous attitude. I think we have to put money in." And so over the years, and we, by the way, we addressed it. We corrected it 4 or 5 times the period that I was there, only to the next year forget about our correction and not put enough money in again. That happened time after time after time. Now people say, well, okay, it's you guys were you're the problem, so why should we have to pay? I say, yes, we were the problem. They are the problem today, or have been. But that's not going to fix the system. The only way to fix the system is both sides start putting some more money in. And I say to those retirees who say, I don't want you touching my retirement, okay, would you rather that the state not touch your retirement now, or would you rather not have any retirement income at all in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years? That's your choices. What's your preference? Again, the last 4 years, they put $7 billion each year into the system. So it's accumulation of a lot of things. There were 2 actors. Well, there were more than 2, obviously. The George Ryan and Rod Blagojevich they spent too much. But by the way, the Democratic-controlled legislature and when the Republicans controlled the Republican-controlled legislature were very much a part of it. Yes, we're trying to please everybody. We're trying to make everybody happy. I was in a meeting one time with the National Conference of State Legislators with a group of senior vice presidents of major corporations in this country. And they said, you know, there were about 5 or 6 of us state legislators from all over the country. They said, you know, what's wrong with you people? You don't do any planning. All you do is react to the crisis of the moment. And I said, you're right. You're absolutely right. By the way, your CEO's salary or his bonus for next year, is that based on some long-term plan, or is that because the profit and loss statement last year was way up? Oh, well, I said, yes, we're human. We react to the crisis of the moment, and we don't always do it well. Phil Rock used to say we get it right about 60–70% of the time. If we were in the major leagues, they'd pay us billions of dollars a year if we could bat 600 or 700. So when we screw it up, we turn around and come back and try to correct it later. So, long answer, I hope I...
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Ken, what about term limits? Can states individually set term limits, or does it have to be a federal?
No, the
Decision?
states can, in the first place, elections are controlled by states. The federal government does not control the elections, it's the states. And so certainly, states can set term limits.
Does any state in the United States of America have term limits?
Oh, yes, but I couldn't tell you who they are right now. And by the way, over the years, those advocates who have been the strongest advocates for term limits, they get elected to office, and then their term, their 6 or 8 years expires, and they say, oh, well, it's different now. I'm going to run again. No, it was wrong back then. It's wrong, period, in my mind. There is an automatic way to limit terms. It's called elections. If you don't like this guy, vote him out the next election. I've won 4 times and I've lost 3 times, and I decided I'm not going to give the voters a chance again. I'm batting over 500. I'm going to keep it that way. Term limits, in the first place, the state of Illinois budget is what now, $37 billion? Is that right? Somebody, somewhere in that neighborhood. You have any idea what it's like to get a hold of what in the world? $37 billion. How do you get enough expertise to know what that's all about? Well, you don't the first several years. And if you learn a little bit by your 5th or 6th year, you're in pretty good shape, and hopefully you're going to keep on learning a little bit more after that. Now, the term limits now, I think, are primarily aimed at Michael Madigan. Mike has been the Speaker of the House of Representatives. I left the State Senate in January of 1985. Michael Madigan was the Speaker of the Illinois House of Representatives my last 2 years in the State Senate, 83 and 84. That's when he first was elected Speaker. Michael Madigan is a brilliant guy. He's a very hardworking guy. I happen to believe that he's honest. And Pat Quinn made Michael Madigan. And I'll tell you why. Pat Quinn is the guy that got the reduction amendment passed for the Illinois House of Representatives, when we went from 3 representatives per district down to 1 each with 2 representative districts in 1 Senate district. When I served in both cases. Pat Quinn's the guy that got that done. And invariably, the representatives, there would be 2 Democrats and 1 Republican elected from the city of Chicago districts. There would be 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat elected from the suburban districts. Invariably, that 1 Republican in the Chicago district or that 1 Democrat in the suburban districts were the best legislators they had. They were smart, they were hardworking. It just, I mean, it happened time after time after time. They were honest. I'm not implying that others that were there are not honest, but these people were just outstanding. And whenever that amendment passed, when Pat Quinn got that amendment passed, immediately that's when all of the legislative leadership, the Speaker, the Minority Leader in the House, the President of the Senate, and the Minority Leader in the Senate, that's when they started raising the big bucks to get people to run for office. The first time I ran for the Senate, or the first time I ran for the House in 1970, got beat. I spent $7,000, of which $4,000 of it was my own money that I borrowed against a life insurance policy. I ended up losing the life insurance policy because I never had the money to pay it back. Second time I ran was for the Senate in 1972. I spent $21,000 in a district that covered 6.5 counties. You tried driving 6.5 counties on a daily basis and so forth. Anyhow, of that $21,000, I had to borrow $3,000, and then 2 years later, I had to run again, and I spent about $40,000 2 years later. Had a tough opponent. I remember Dawn Netsch. She came in the Senate the same year I did, and she and a good buddy of hers who was running for a House district in her district. They ran their campaigns together, and they spent $95,000. I couldn't believe it. $95,000? I spent $19,000. Well, after I got beat for Congress in '84, and in '92, Rock and some other people talked me into coming back and running again. I spent $340,000 in 1992 and got beat. My opponent spent $1 million. This is for a state Senate seat. 4 years later, Barb Brown and David Luchtefeld ran for the same seat. They each spent $1 million. This is crazy. But that's politics today. I am absolutely convinced that the reason Paul Simon decided to retire from the United States Senate when he did was he was so tired of begging people for money and what people then, and some people, not very many, but some groups or whatever would expect in return. And Paul was just sick and tired of that, I think. I never asked him that, but I'm thinking that's what it was. But anyhow, the cost of politics has gone up, and it was the Michael Madigans of the world that can control now a Democrat in the House of Representatives. They don't vote the way Madigan tells them to every time. But they also make it a point that they don't really want to tee him off too much, because if they tee him off too much, he can recruit an opponent against them in the next Democratic primary and give them unlimited funds to run. Hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Just a greeting. The Heron Historical Society manages a page on Facebook, And we always post our meeting notices ahead of time. So when I posted your meeting notice, there were several comments about the radio stations, etc.
Oh,
And a gentleman named Jim Cox said to please tell you hello.
yep, I worked with Jim Cox at WGGH in Marion. He was, Jim was a very good disc jockey, and went to St. Louis and became quite a TV personality in St. Louis. Jim was also a Baptist preacher. I was not a Baptist preacher. Jim didn't always approve of me, but that's all right. We got along fine.
He said to tell you hi.
Well, thank you. Good. Jim was a great guy.
I think what we'll do, Ken, anybody who has additional questions, just hang out. We have lots of time for that. We have some refreshments.
And I'd like to say something. We have these historical lectures every month, and we're going on our 7th year. And I thank Gordon and some of the others that's helped get people for the speakers. But I'd also like to mention that you have a board, and that besides coming once a month for this, they also have to come for a board meeting every month. And they were all here last night, board meeting and setting up. And so I would just like for the board members that are here to stand up and let everyone see who you are. We've got Gordon and Bert and Donald and Cookie and Cheryl with TR and Linda Gale with always working the desk where we come in, and we have Jetta here that helps out whenever we have bus trips coming in. We've got Becky Boston over here who is getting ready to maybe dip into an endeavor that might take a lot more work for her. And I want to say thank you to those guys.
Yeah.
And certainly thank Ken Buzbee. It was a fascinating affair.
I was here last month, by the way, to hear Terry Clark. Terry and I have become very good friends. Well, we just met about a year ago. We both served on the SIU Chancellor Search Committee together. I was one of 3 outsiders. Terry's very much an insider. And I came to hear Terry. I didn't know all of his life story. I had heard the story about how he met his wife. What an incredible, incredible story. Meets this woman in the middle of London, and then they both leave. She calls her mother that night and said, I met the man today that I'm going to marry. I don't know his name. And then didn't know where to find her. And then the next day, one of his fellow band members ran into her in another part of London and invited her to come and sing with their street band again. And Terry is one of, he is a delight. I